For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon Ryhove. With me in the studio is Ebrahim Fakir, Manager for Governance Institutions and Processes at the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa, to provide an analysis on the recent local government elections. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Thanks, Shannon.
Now, this year's local government election saw voter turnout at 57.6%. What message do you think this shows about local governance?
I think it's a very encouraging message. It's a very encouraging message because it appears as if 10% more South Africans, compared to the 2000 and 2006 local government elections, believe that local government is increasingly important. And I think it's a very encouraging message because local government is citizens' first interface with any institution of government, firstly. Secondly, it's also something which has been demonstrated over the past 10 years is the coalface of what citizens or where citizens actually demand things from government. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that though this is encouraging, South Africans are using dual ways of expressing themselves. It's encouraging that citizens believe that using the ballot is one way of providing political expression, but they also believe that taking to the streets or using their voice through tax boycotts or rates boycotts is increasingly becoming a tool for political expression. And so overall it is encouraging. I'm sure the IEC would be encouraged by this. The government would be encouraged by this because it shows up a greater degree of credibility and some degree of legitimacy in the system of governance. But not losing sight of the fact that different forms and different modes of political expression will be used by citizens, because that's a demand for a level of responsiveness and accountability. But if government appears, and especially locally elected politicians take their mandate more seriously, particularly in the way in which they relate to their constituencies, we could well see turnout levels increasing over time. But if perceptions about unaccountable councillors, unresponsive councillors, a local governance system which is actually in crisis, which it has been for the past 10 years, we may find that in the next 5 years when we have the next local government elections, the trend may reverse. But there are very different reasons why I think this has happened. Of course, there's increasing awareness that local government's important. Parties, I think, quite differently from the previous elections, took this local government election way more seriously than they did before. And that's also encouraging. If we just think about the kind of interest that candidates had shown across all different political parties for wanting to either be on the ward, be chosen as a ward candidate or be on the PR list, I think that sustained the kind of momentum for interest in the local government elections. And I think everyone came to the party this time round because even amongst civil actors in society, the level of interest was fairly high. There were a lot more observers who were watching this local government election. The media played its part quite spectacularly, as it has previously. But I think I think society all around should take credit for this turnout.
Now, the official opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, received 23.9% of the vote, with the ruling African National Congress dropping to 62% from 67% in 2006. What do you think this says about democracy in South Africa?
Well, I think factually, the ANC sort of almost relatively maintained a level of support, even though it lost a small degree of vote share. So in fact, I think the numbers are slightly different in the sense that the ANC would come out overall with about 62% of support as compared to what they may have got in 2000. Interestingly, this trend has reversed for the ANC, because from 1994 in every election, national and local, it enjoyed a greater proportion of the vote share. But in 2009 in the national election and in this 2011 local government election, its share of the overall vote actually declined. Incidentally, it also lost control of a significant number of councils that it previously controlled. Now, the opposition party, the DA, the main opposition party, of course, did better than I suspect it itself expected and better than most observers expected. But I'm not sure and I'm not convinced that they capitalized on a large number of African voters or black voters as they claim. Of course, there is a proportion of African or black voters which did vote for the DA, There's no doubt that that's the case. But it is not as dramatic as I think they would have us believe, firstly. Secondly, it's far too early for us to have crunched all of the numbers to tell whether we can verify the fact that there is a sea change in political attitudes among South Africans, with a large number who are in fact willing to think of the opposition party. Now, what message this has for democracy overall, however, is that there is a degree of healthy competition going on amongst political parties. There's a plethora of political parties, some of course which appear to have disappeared in this election simply because they garnered less than 1% of the vote overall, and in fact control no councils whatsoever, except for a few independents and one or two other small parties which control collectively about 10 councils. But there is diversity in the political system. So if we think of democracy as diversity, there is a degree of diversity going on, but that diversity doesn't have terribly much impact in the political and governance system overall. Because their representation is so small, their ability to hold a ruling party to account and demand a level of accountability or exercise oversight over it is diminished. Its ability to craft policy differently is also diminished. And that, of course, in a democracy matters. Oversight, accountability, ability to actually impact and shape a different policy agenda does matter in a democracy, because that's where the real contest of ideas must happen. And if the other parties are so weak, including the main opposition party, because if we look at the differential, its ability to actually shape policy and impact on a change on it is being diminished. However, they should be given some credit for the way in which they've exercised a degree of oversight, exposed wrongdoing, exposed corruption, exposed capacity weaknesses and other weaknesses in the state and in governance. And that, of course, is useful and healthy. So there are good democratic outcomes which are emerging. But whether these democratic outcomes are about the way in which the governance system works, or whether this is about a change in citizen attitudes, is a different question, which of course we can only answer in the future once we look more seriously at the data and whether there is some fundamental change in attitude taking place. To the extent that there is some change in attitude taking place, the suspicion is that a large number of South Africans continue to support the African National Congress, and they do so across all the different electoral platforms, whether it be national or local government elections, and in provincial elections, of course. And this election has borne that out. So literally the story of this election was in fact a story of more of the same, with a few small incremental changes, a disappearance of smaller parties, well, not quite disappearing, but certainly losing traction, and an emergence of a competitive, dominant, two-party dominant system. That will raise serious questions about the diversity of different voices in the political system, and that matters for democracy. But it also may raise questions about whether the two-party system may be more efficacious for the way in which oversight, accountability, transparency, and policy change may occur overall through the governance system. But in many senses, we are still a society and a state in the making. So this local government election, in terms of what its democratic impact has been, I think has been significant.
Now, the DA's vote increased from 14% in 2006 to almost 24%. Where do you think this increase came from? Do you think it came from smaller parties or from ANC support?
Given that we haven't drilled down to the data at ward level and look at what the kind of actual dynamics in specific wards across the 280 municipalities are, it's difficult to tell. The second is all these assumptions we have about how different races may be voting for different parties still need to be verified. Although there are early indicators that identity voting is still very much the case. When we talk about identity voting, we're not just talking about a racial census. We're talking about how people identify culturally and otherwise with a leader and the outlook of a political party. Given that that's the case, of course, a large number of the DA's voters, in direct response to your question, have traditionally come from those people who identify with the Democratic Alliance, its values and its leaders, quite importantly. And unfortunately, because race still is a very serious and primary identity marker for most South Africans, is one of the issues which is going to shape political attitudes and political compatibility. So a large number of the voters of the DA remain traditionally those who would have been DA voters, which largely come from the white community. Of course, the DA managed to attract a large number of voters from minority communities such as the Indian and coloured community. But there too, we need to look more seriously at what the turnout levels in those particular communities were. And suspicions are that in some of those areas, turnout was not as high as it was in others. That said, of course, the DA managed to get its voters out, and that's what a political party does at election time. So, of course, they ought to be congratulated for that. But the reality is that they managed to get their voters out. The ANC didn't. And so that's really where the DA's voters are coming from its traditional support base. Of course, there's incremental support from other communities for the DA, and that's to be expected in a democratic society where people have the freedom of choice and conscience to make choices about political parties that they wish to support. The claims that they've been dramatic increases, and this is a watershed moment which has seen a change in political attitudes, I'm not sure that that is the case. Of course, there are changing political attitudes in society, but those changing political attitudes are based on the fact that a lot of people still continue to view the ANC as their party of choice, but will demand a level of accountability and responsiveness from the ANC, not by supporting another political party, but by taking to the streets or engaging in other kinds of political action. And that's where the real change in political, or continuity, some would say, of political attitudes and shaping of political aspirations are. And there's continuities with our past, particularly with protest and resistance politics pre-1990, and that has continued in the kind of social protests which have happened across the country over the past decade. So while there are some incremental changes in support for the DA across the country in communities, it is not as dramatic as might be suggested. If we look at the increase in vote share that they got from roughly 16% up to 24%, part of that is attributable to the fact that they managed to get their voters out who previously may have been fairly complacent. And if you look particularly at a place like the Western Cape and city of Cape Town, their turnout levels were very high, and a lot of those were DA voters. The second contributory factor is that, remember, we had close to 2 million new registrations on the voters' roll from the 1990 elections. And so this is just a period of 2 years that we're talking about. And naturally, a proportion of those new voters have new political attitudes because they're coming into a new society, and they would, from amongst the different political choices, make a choice from the DA. So part of the increase for the DA has also come from a set of new voters who are on the voters' roll. But anyone who's willing to suggest in very concrete terms that there is a dramatic increase for the DA amongst previously ANC voters or amongst African voters is actually not really looking at the data, because the only way in which we can tell this, and because the vote is your secret, there's no way you can tell which race or which identity is voting which way. But we can draw reasonable assumptions, not from suburban areas, because those are the areas which have changed most demographically, but from township areas which demographically didn't change, and to see whether there is a change in voting patterns in those particular voting stations. That's the only way in which we would really know that there is a change in support amongst black South Africans towards the DA.
Now, in that same vein, the ANC said it was disappointed over its performance in Indian and coloured townships around Johannesburg, with the party losing previously held areas such as Eldorado Park and Lenasia. What in your opinion, are the reasons for these losses?
Well, I think there are several reasons, and of course this should be a wake-up call to the ANC, not just because they've lost support in minority communities, but also because they lost vote share, and because in a place like the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan Municipality, the majority that it won by this time is much slimmer, by a margin of 15% compared to 2006. So it seems as if their support base is not shrinking, but would prefer to stay away and challenge them differently rather than give them a mandate through a vote. So they've got some serious thinking to do. But the reality is that the ANC's campaign firstly was lackluster. Even though it managed to fill a stadium in its large rally, it was only able to do so through attracting and bussing in people, which is what political parties naturally do. But it wasn't able to attract the kind of diversity of support that it usually does, firstly. Secondly, though its campaign appeared to be quite vibrant, it didn't really have a targeted message. It appeared to have been all over the place. There was no segmented message for different communities. There was no real key message which was driven through the ANC's campaign. It lacked a programmatic focus, which ANC campaigns usually have. And so that's the second contributory factor which I think affected its performance overall. Thirdly, I think perceptions amongst the communities that the ANC itself singles out, Indian and coloured communities, I'm not sure that sufficient groundwork has happened over the last 3 or 4 years from the ANC to continue to keep these communities and traditional supporters within the ANC. So I think those are the contextual political reasons why. Fourthly, which also falls into the contextual political dimension, is the ANC's messaging has increasingly come across as quite narrow, is focused quite specifically on a particular racial sector of our society. And of course, I think people in Indian and coloured communities, though traditionally supporting the ANC, are asking serious questions about whether the ANC continues to be a leader in society, firstly, and secondly, if it is purporting to be this leader of society, who is it trying to lead for and for what purpose? And many of the conclusions they reach is that the kind of policy and ideological fractures that happen within the ANC and the factionalism which has taken root to a large extent sometimes not on policy or ideological fracture but on personality issues and on issues of corruption, tender irregularities, jobs for pals kind of thing, that they become increasingly uncomfortable with that mode of governance because they don't believe those are the traditional values and the traditional way in which the ANC functions. And of course, when Julius Malema says the kind of things that he did lastly, and this is another political issue which I think does affect communities, saying things like the DA is for minorities and for whites, the ANC does appear to become increasingly more narrow Africanist in its approach. Of course, many of these communities will begin to feel alienated and out of the fold of the ANC. So they may not yet be prepared to completely support a different political party, but they're not at the same time interested or at least as keen on the ANC. So those are the political contextual factors. In terms of the numbers game, I think it's also true that in many of these communities, traditional ANC supporters simply stayed away from the polls because they didn't want to vote for the ANC for a range of perception problems. A, that they weren't engaged enough. B, the campaign was all over the place. They didn't really feel included. They feel alienated slightly from the ANC. They don't like some of the messaging coming out, so they just stayed away. They, of course, can recapture them, but of course it will require a serious degree of hard work. And I think those are primarily the reasons why the ANC has lost support in many of these communities, or at least their support has kind of been stymied for a while. But one of the main challenges, I think, is the lack of groundwork that the ANC has done and has not done in these communities, and secondly, the perception emerging about what's actually going on in the ANC and the way in which the ANC is governing and is running not just the country, but itself as an organization.
Well, thank you very much for that analysis. It was very interesting.